Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Welcome to today's reading from Brilliant as the Sun, Retelling of Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 5, the Universal Order. We're going to read from chapter 14. Shukadeva explains Bharat's analogy. Shukadeva thanked Parikshit for his question. Plainly he intended it for the karma mimamsa adherents who believed they could find happiness in the pleasures of the material world. He said, "My dear king," this is verse 1, "a merchant always desires money. He sometimes enters the forest to find commodities like wood, fruits, or flowers that he can sell in the city for a good price. Similarly, the conditioned soul, being greedy for sensual enjoyment, enters the material world. Just as the merchant can become lost in the dense forest, the bewildered soul becomes entrapped by Krishna's external energy. Although confused, he relies on his own judgment to find his way out and does not take guidance from Krishna's devotees. Upon entering the material world, the pure soul identifies with the material body. Impelled by the modes of nature, he enters different bodies, birth after birth. Sometimes he gets a celestial body in the heavenly planets, and sometimes an animal body or birth in the lower planets. In some bodies he enjoys and suffers a mixture of happiness and distress, and in others he suffers severe miseries. The false paradigms of life he entertained while in the human form determine these bodies." What do you mean? Let me give you an example. While in a human body, a person may falsely believe that intoxication is the highest happiness. This is a false concept, a mental speculation that leads him to indulge in sinful activities. In his next life, he will get a lower body like that of an ant, which is suitable for enjoying intoxication. Everyone wants happiness without suffering, but baffled by the material energy, they get the opposite. After each tribulation, the conditioned soul may get some temporary relief, perhaps by going to heaven, but he will soon suffer again. Unfortunately, because of his faith in his own false speculations, he will not take guidance from Krishna's pure devotees, who are like bees hovering around the nectar of Krishna's lotus feet. Only they can help the conditioned soul to escape the miseries of material existence. Parikshit said, "Why did Bharat compare the 6 senses to plunderers and one's spouse and children to ferocious animals?" Verse 2, Shukadeva said, "My dear king, the aim of human life is to know and love Krishna. When the conditioned soul enters the forest of material existence, his mind and 5 knowledge-acquiring senses mislead him into wasting his time and money pursuing sense gratification. Thus the senses are plunderers. They rob us of our valuable time and wealth, which are meant for Krishna's service." Verse 3, as for one's spouse and children, Bharat compared them to ferocious animals like tigers and jackals, because they too devour our precious time and resources as wild animals snatch away one's livestock. Why did he not call them plunderers too? As wild animals are easier to deter than human dacoits, so family members are more easily controlled than one's own senses. How notice that the conditioned soul does not realize the obvious futility of material life? Asked Parikshit. Verse 4, Shukadeva said, every year farmers plough their grain fields, completely uprooting all the weeds, but they again come up. Why? Because the seeds are still in the earth. Precisely, said Shukadeva, even if a person becomes disgusted with family life and give it up, the seeds of material desire stay deep in the heart, waiting to sprout again. Does the following the vows of a sannyasi destroy these desires? Shukadeva shook his head. You can remove camphor from a pot and then thoroughly wash it, but still the aroma will remain. So this is another analogy. Similarly, one can give up family life and take vows of renunciation, but the desires for material enjoyment remain in the heart. There are so many instances in history of sannyasis returning to worldly pleasures. We can only destroy the seeds of material desires by Krishna's transcendental loving service. Until the heart is flooded with love for Krishna, we will not be free of the tendency for material enjoyment. Parikshit thought of the ascetic sages. This could help them. Verse 5, Shukadeva continued explaining the allegory. As mosquitoes, locusts, vultures and rats trouble the merchant, evil men who cheat him of his possessions disturb the conditioned soul. And as in a forest we may sometimes see a mirage of a house in the distance, the conditioned soul, lusty for material enjoyment, fantasizes about material achievements and happiness, or he thinks whatever current success he is enjoying is permanent. Verse 6, the material world is like an illusory castle in the sky, a mirage. Unlike the spiritual world, it is substantial and ephemeral. The conditioned soul who pursues the pleasures of this world is like an animal chasing a mirage in the desert. Verse 7, sometimes, my dear king, a man lost in the forest feels freezing. At such times, when he sees the phosphorescent light coming from a marsh, he runs toward it thinking it is fire. Similarly, a conditioned soul, overly influenced by passion, ardently runs after gold. He does not realize that gold attracts sinful influences, and therefore the wise consider it to be no better than yellow excrement. Verse 8, the merchant busies himself in the forest trying to find commodities he can sell. Similarly, the conditioned soul busily tries to maintain himself and his family. Even when he secures his necessities, he hankers for more and more comfort. He is always so busy, he has no time to cultivate self-realization. Verse 9, sometimes there are fires in the forest that create whirlwinds, creating a perilous situation for anyone in the vicinity who are blinded by smoke and dust. Similarly, when the conditioned soul becomes blinded by lust, he forgets the God's witness his every action. And he transgresses all religious principles regulating sex. For this he must later endure terrible punishment. As a king, Parikshit was well aware of the inherent hazards of illicit sex, which ultimately creates chaos in society. It leads to unwanted pregnancies, which result in the children being neglected, abandoned, or aborted. The man and woman responsible for this suffering must later undergo the same suffering they inflicted on the child. The king shook his head sadly. Does the conditioned soul never apprehend his precarious situation? Verse 10, Shukadeva said, "Oh yes, sometimes he sees how futile his attempt for body. He soon forgets and again pursues the mirage of worldly pleasure." Verses 11 and 12, as mentioned earlier, the harsh words of his enemies or government men always afflict him, which Bharat compared to the sounds of cricket and owls in a forest. The conditioned soul sometimes enjoys thanks to his past pious activities, but after exhausting his good karma, he seeks help from wealthy men who are like the living dead. Seeing the king's puzzled expression, Shukadeva said, "The living dead are those who do not know how to achieve happiness either in this life or the next. They are compared to poisonous creepers, trees, or wells because their misuse of wealth brings nothing but misery. Only by using wealth in Krishna's service can it bring happiness." Parikshit said, "Does the poor conditioned soul never give up his hopes for worldly happiness despite so many disappointments?" Verse 13, Shukadeva said, "He just keeps trying. In frustration, he seeks material benefits by turning to cheating gurus and sadhus." This is verse 13, "and sadhus for cheap blessings." This is like seeking relief from unbearable heat by diving into a shallow river. You simply break your neck. There are so many cheaters who manufacture their own way of so-called spiritual realization. They use their mystic powers to befuddle people, magically producing gold and other things, and fools revere them. This type of cheating will become increasingly prominent in the age of Kali. Unfortunately, misguided conditioned soul does not know how to identify the true guru. What then is the characteristic of a genuine guru? He should relieve his disciple from the bodily concept of life, just like Bharat did for Rahugana. He thus frees his disciple from the miseries and struggles of material life. Verse 14, let me continue to explain Bharat's analogy. He described how the afflicted traveler jumps into a shallow lake to seek relief and simply injures himself, which is like the impoverished, conditioned soul begging from others. In fact, he becomes so degraded that he will even steal from his own father or son, giving them all sorts of trouble. Kali Yuga will deteriorate to where a person will harass or even kill his own relative for a small gain. Parikshit covered his face with his hands. How terrible were the times to come! How much the poor people would suffer. Verse 15, Shukadeva said, "There is no genuine happiness in material existence. Even the family life, the living entities suffer as if burning in a forest fire, and their suffering increases with each passing year. Sometimes the living entity may condemn himself for his past impiety, but because he identifies with the material body, he cannot get any relief. Will the kings not help these poor souls?" asked Parikshit. Verse 16, Shukadeva's expressions was grave, especially in Kali Yuga. Government officials are like yakshas and rakshasas. As Bharat said, just as these ferocious species suck men's blood, the rulers will tax their citizens to the point of death. So we'll resume our reading from here onwards. Thank you for joining. I am that's it. Hare Krishna.